All right, so it's 11:30 on the dot, so we'll get started. So my name is Sean Wells. I work in public sector's CTO office, and for this conversation, I write a lot of the DoD STIGs and the baselines, and I also am one of the maintainers of something called OpenSCAP, which is our strategy for security automation. And we're really fortunate today to have Jeff of NSA join us. So, Jeff.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Sean. I'm Jeff Blank. I'm a tech director for an office within NSA's Information Assurance Directorate. That's NSA's defensive mission that does security analysis of operating systems and applications. And we've invested a lot in, from the government side, in trying to get industry interested in security automation by publishing a series of standards to that end. And I'm very happy to see this kind of uptake. So thanks.
Yeah, so today, part of the idea is to really kind of tell everybody what's the latest in security automation, both from the perspective of Red Hat, as well as the perspective of the US government. So what standards are coming, how's Red Hat implementing them, and we'll define kind of the RHEL 7 roadmap, as well as the more nebulous like RHEL Future and RHEL 8 and what we're doing with that, including containers. And then also really talk about tools. So the second part of this conversation is going to be a series of demos where those who came early saw me compiling my demo and quickly scanning, make sure I didn't break anything. But we'll go through, actually assess compliance on RHEL 7, answer questions of like, if I want to take the US military baseline, how do I tailor it for my own needs and run a scan with that tailored content, both locally, like a command line, as well as through satellite for a group of systems. And we're assuming my demo doesn't break in the next like 30 minutes, we'll also start doing introspective scanning of Docker containers. So let's say you have a Docker registry and you want to scan everything for both configuration miscompliance, like PCI or HIPAA, as well as CVEs, you know, binary, heartbleed, things like that. So with that, one of the things we forgot to do last year was ask, kind of by a show of hands, how many people are not government? Like banks and finance. Holy crap.
That's great.
That's awesome. So in the past, you know, this is the second year, and it was always, you know, the spooks, like people who didn't want to raise their hand from three-letter agencies. So we try and gauge how much commercial uptake there are.
Well, maybe they're really government.
Or maybe, yeah, contractors raise their hand, right? So the idea then is we ask, so if most people are more or less commercial, does anybody follow the government baselines, like the DoD STIG? A little bit, or how about PCI compliance? Much more. So we will tailor the demos, basically, to do PCI compliance over DoD STIG. And we'll keep kind of asking questions like that. So we got some demos, we'll talk about the roadmap. What other kind of things do you guys want to see? I mean, you're all here for a reason. C2S, okay. So there's a profile that's inspired by the Center for Internet Security. So we can show that, because that's pretty commercially applicable. Thank you. All right, so let's get rolling. I guess you have to point it directly like 2 feet away. So with that, we have some use cases. So for those who, you know, we'll get into SCAP, but we really have more or less 3 or 4 problem areas that we're trying to solve. The first that we've mentioned is configuration management. Like, are my passwords the right length? Do I have crypto enabled appropriately? And then we also want to talk vulnerability attestations. So known software flaws, things that have a CVE or a Red Hat security errata. I want to go ahead and scan and know if these apply to me, whether it's bare metal, virtual, container, we don't care. And then there's also the ability to start doing things like system inventory management. So what operating systems do I have installed, and do they have any known malware? So the malware detection's an evolving space. So I want to, you know, pre-condition everybody to say that's where we're talking about what we're planning on doing for like RHEL Next and RHEL 8, not necessarily for RHEL 7. So that's more of a conversational. And with that, kind of turn it over to Jeff.
Oh, sure. Thanks, Sean. That's great. So, you know, as everybody probably knows, SCAP stands for the Security Content Automation Protocol. Funny enough, it's not actually a protocol. It's actually a series of data formats that are all defined in XML, although more later on that about it becoming a network protocol. But the real point is that, you know, the government felt there was a serious need for having standardized formats for expressing this kind of information. I'll get into all the exact ones in the next slide, but the general idea is that if you have a series of standardized inputs, which are flexible depending on your security needs, like compliance baselines or status queries about software inventory or that kind of thing, you should be able to get standardized outputs from a system. And originally, at least, the thought was that you could do this with a variety of third-party tools, and they would all be consistent. And in fact, NIST has a validation program trying to ensure consistency there, although I'll talk more later about what the government strategy is there with regard to endpoints and third-party tools. But the nice thing about SCAP today is that you could have one compliance baseline, and you should still be able to expect that a variety of tools that you have installed on your endpoint can provide the same basic results based on the information that they're after. And that it gives you some interoperability, at least in a sense, as to data in, data out, and it should allow you to have avoid some vendor lock-in. You don't need to make some sort of specialized language tied to your requirements. You should be able to select whatever tool is best for your use at that time. And backing that up, of course, that there is federal procurement language requiring SCAP in some cases. There was an OMB memo a few years back that was the first one. And right now, DHS has this large effort called Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigations that they're working on. It used to be Continuous Diagnostics and Monitoring, but then monitoring has bad connotation, especially if we're anywhere involved. So now it's Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigations. And so here are, let's see.
Try the button that looks like a right arrow.
Oh, yeah, good call, thanks. Thank you. So what's an SCAP? Again, Security Content Automation Protocol. The foundational one that's probably the closest to what humans see in day-to-day life is XCDF, which stands for Extensible Configuration Checklist Document Format. This is essentially the security guide, just in an XML format, in a consistent XML schema. For the most part, it's just a series of rules that you want to check compliance against. There are individual items there that you'd expect, like title, the actual description text, and then references there to some kind of external checking system, which brings me to the next slide.
2 feet away.
Oh, now too far. So XCDF contains the configuration checklist that you've got, and that can be rendered, as Sean will show later, in HTML using any style sheet you'd like, right? Some style sheets are prettier than others. The Red Hat one looks pretty good, I think. And then, of course, the XCDF, each rule that specifies what you're actually trying to look for in your compliance baseline can refer to either an OVAL schema or OSL. OVAL is Open Vulnerability Assessment Language. That's also an XML schema that instructs an OVAL interpreter how to look inside the system and determine whether the setting that you're after is actually set the right way. OSL is Open Content Interactive Language, I think. I don't know. Probably, yeah. And that's designed for doing questionnaires, things like that. I mean, there are some settings about a system that you simply can't can't be automated in some way. Stuff regarding the BIOS, maybe things about physical protection. So OSL was invented for that reason. And by the way, these are all open specifications managed by NIST, often historically with the support of MITRE. And then there are what I'd say is the enumerations layer, which exists to let you know what is actually there. CCE is Common Configuration Enumeration. It basically just gives you a numerical identifier for the kind of setting you're checking for. Like, just as an easy example, password length. For each version of RHEL, there would be an identifier, just an identifier purely to let you know you're talking about password length, let's say inside one of the configuration files. That's CCE. CPE is Common Platform Enumeration. And I'll talk a little bit later about how that's getting replaced with software ID tags. This is all in motion, of course. But CPE gives unique identifiers for the actual piece of software or indeed the OS platform. So that's there just as a common identifier so that you know you're talking about a particular thing. And CVE, finally, everyone is very familiar with and was very successful in establishing an identifier for a particular vulnerability in a particular product. And that's common vulnerabilities and exposures, is CVE. So a lot of acronyms. And then, of course, CVSS is a common vulnerability scoring system, which has, unfortunately, from my perspective, that it is frequently scrunched down into one number. But there really are 6 different fields, like access vector, other types of severity, that give you a good description about like what the bug actually means.
So yeah, to really distill this, it allows us to create a human-readable prose guide that says, set your passwords, set your crypto, set your disks in the following way. and that's that checklist language. The oval is just a machine code that allows us to do red light, green light, pass, or fail. But if we write content for, say, Apache, to make sure all of our Apache hosts have PKI enabled, I can write a regex to query the Apache config file, and that same content can be used in the Red Hat tooling or Tripwire or Splunk, so that's a benefit there. And it also can be cross-platform. So I can give you one security checklist that'll work on, say, Mac, Linux, and Windows. So it allows us to standardize that. And then that risk measurement, one of the things is like, all right, so I write a security checklist for PCI compliance, but how do I know what's more important? How do I know if this is a high severity or a low severity? And that's that risk measurement. So now we can pair a little bit of intelligence of risk score with your checklist. So it's not just pass or fail, it's you fail and this is remotely exploitable, so it's like super severe. Or you fail, but you already have to be root to exploit this, so maybe you don't care as much. So that's kind of all these protocols are in a language. And then with that.
Great, sounds good, thanks. And so, right, being here from the government, I'll give you a quick view of the government on these things. So, I mean, there are two big US government evaluation programs that everybody's probably heard of. One is the NIST's FIPS 140 program for evaluating cryptographic modules, and the other one is Common Criteria, which is executed by NIAP, which is the National Information Assurance Partnership, which has to do with expressing the IA functionality requirements in products. And vendors, I guess, actively seek both of these evaluations as a way of letting their government customers know that, in fact, they've met the government's requirements for this. NIAP evaluation is required for use in US national security systems, while, of course, FIPS is required for protecting sensitive information on any US federal information. And in fact, NIST even says that if it hasn't gone through FIPS, they don't assign any value to whatever encryption might be happening. And both of them have provenance in policies of the government. For example, NIAP evaluation is required through the CNSS Policy 11 for use in national security systems, and FIPS has basis in the Federal Information Security Management Act of 2002, and I think the 1996 IT Management Reform Act. I'm probably getting the name a little bit wrong, but there's strong policy basis and legal basis for both of these.
So since we're talking to largely commercial, how many people know what Common Criteria is? So just more than we thought. So before we're going to keep mentioning it, so it's probably worth a couple of minutes. So the idea is when Red Hat makes a claim that says something like, we page in data into memory, and then when you deallocate it, we swap it out and zero that memory out. So we make this claim that I can page data into memory and page it out, and when I page it out, Red Hat erases it so there's no residual data left. So we make this security claim. What Common Criteria does is they actually take a look at our source code to make sure this security claim is implemented correctly, as well as functionally attested. So like, yes, you're doing the 14-way, wipe it with zeros, wipe it with randoms, wipe it with zeros, and repeat. So whether that's something like our claims about SE Linux and how if we apply a label to JBoss and a label to Oracle, we can say they don't talk. The NSA actually goes in with a third-party lab and verifies, well, NIAP.
Yeah, so
but they go and verify.
NIAP is a program office that is run by NSA and uses NIST-accredited test labs, third-party test labs, because that's the only way to make evaluation activity scale. But the final validation does come to the NIAP office, and they see, oh yes, in fact, this testing did occur, and it meets the requirements that were defined in the protection profile. Yeah. So that's there's a reason why I mention these things, and has to do with security automation. First off is that Common Criteria evaluations are now down to about 90 days for many product types, and we've recently revamped that in the OS space. Previously, OS evaluations, and Red Hat has one underway, did take on the order of almost 2 years, which just doesn't really keep pace with industry in any way seriously. And so we did release a completely revamped OS protection profile later last year. One vendor's already gone through evaluations, so that's at least, consider that proof that it's possible, right? And we look forward to working with Red Hat for evaluations of future versions of RHEL against that particular protection profile in a very timely manner. The other thing we're doing that I think is great, and I did some policy and legal work internally to get permission for, is developing the protection profile documents, which are the actual requirements, on GitHub. and it's right there. People can go see it if they'd like. But how this relates to security automation is that we're encouraging the development of administrative guidance as part of those formal evaluations, also in SCAP. It's just one more way for us to reinforce the fact that we care about security automation and that we want guidance to be ideally created by the vendor, in accordance with the government's requirements for its format. And one of the other things we're doing that I know a lot of folks, mostly in the government, care about is providing NIST 800-53 tables so that you know if a common criteria evaluation has occurred for the product, that it'll help you satisfy these security controls for your overall network. And that supports risk management framework-based accreditation processes, which are common in the government right now, and unfortunately, I think frequently misunderstood. But that's an entirely different talk. It's a good idea, and so unfortunately today, product evaluation and hardening guidance are frequently developed separately. People confuse them with what does it mean? For example, if I have a STIG, has the product been evaluated? Well, maybe not, but we're hoping for ever tighter integration, especially within government, for those two things to march along together and to support automation. Thanks. So right now, SCAP is defined in that series of specifications that I mentioned. It's at version 1.2, and it's all just data formats, right? I mean, that's useful, but it's not where we really could be. So SCAP 2.0, which isn't out yet, and it could be, possibly a year or two, is working on adding messaging protocols for data transport over the network. And the primary, group doing that work is in the IETF, and they have a security automation and continuous monitoring working group, or SACM. People might say IETF SACM. And there's NSA and DHS and NIST heavy participation in that working group, along with a lot of folks in industry. And the real point of this is that it'll give you interoperability at the network layer. So right now, network devices and endpoints like Red Hat Enterprise Linux systems, if they want to talk elsewhere in the network and provide their assessment results or information about their security state, who knows what would happen? They would talk to probably some kind of vertically integrated system. In this case, Satellite is provided by Red Hat, and of course, Satellite knows how to talk to Red Hat hosts. But is Satellite going to be able to ask network infrastructure devices like routers and switches anything about their security state? If so, it's not based on any kind of open standard that's already published, right? So this effort's designed to give interoperability between all the different nodes on a network. And it's based on a lot of trusted computing group work in the past. So probably easy to find announcements about how the trusted computing groups, trusted network connect, and network endpoint assessment protocols are going to be the basis for SCAP 2.0.
So what would you say is a sample use case of all of this? Like, how would people use it? You boot, and then what?
Well, I mean, the idea, right, is sort of getting to the third bullet point there. You should be able to get any network endpoint, like a PC or a server or a network infrastructure device, and just out of the box, it should be able to tell the enterprise some information about its security state.
So part of the idea is, where we're getting at is, let's say you have OpenStack and you blow out like 30 nodes of a web server and some database servers. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could build in logic into OpenStack or OpenShift or other management tools like CloudForms that say things like, are all of my endpoints PCI compliant? Let me do a couple seconds of a scan. If yes, allow them on the network. If no, let an admin know. So that's kind of that from the power button. Power button gets pressed, then we measure the BIOS, make sure there wasn't like a rogue USB device inserted. Then we measure the operating system boot and make sure device drivers are signed and you have the right modules. And then we do the configuration check like a PCI or a DoD STIG. And all of these things have to pass before you're allowed to fully boot into an interactive mode or just get an IP address. So is that kind of workflow interesting? Okay.
So there's big vision with this, right? Not going to happen overnight, but people are working on it, and it certainly is the government strategy for that to be where we end up. And then one other quick mention here, also as part of that effort, we mentioned common platform enumeration earlier as being the identifier for pieces of software, like individual software packages, for example, in Red Hat's case, like RPMs, or an OS platform itself. So CPE, if you've seen its webpage lately, it's clear that it's a dwindling effort at this point. It's still valid and everything, but it's going to be replaced by software ID tags, which is an ISO standard for identifying software. And includes cryptographic measures also. So that's just one more example of the way this is active and changing going forward. And so the other related question is, well, how about the baselines themselves, right? And so Red Hat, Sean, you may want to talk about this actually with regard to the federal civilian use case.
Yeah, so one of the things we've ended up doing is, as Jeff mentioned, the expectation is that the vendor will author configuration guidance for their products. So like a security guide for RHEL, a security guide for JBoss, and so forth. What we've ended up doing, and we'll show it in a minute, is throwing all of that development on an open source project on GitHub. And it kind of invited industry, academia, government to create a catalog of security controls. So like all the different nerd knobs that we can think of that are security relevant, and document how to verify them, how to set them, what their impact might be. Like if you turn this syscontrol setting, you're going to break your web server. So documenting these hierarchy of needs, if you will. And out of that big catalog, we derive baselines. So we go to the government and say, hey, federal civilian, here's a big catalog. Based on the requirements you gave us, we're going to group 200 security checks into the US government baseline. Do you agree that it's comprehensive? Do you agree we've included everything that you think should be there? And we do that for the civilians, like FBI, Department of Energy. And we also do that for the intelligence or national security systems with the military, what's called a DoD STIG, or a DoD security guide. So what we've ended up doing is we're actually going to show for the military guys the pre-release RHEL 7 STIG. I know there's a lot of questions about that. And then we also just last week, one of the Red Hat solution architects wrote the baseline for Department of Justice. So it's how to house and handle like criminal data, like evidence that need to be submitted in court. So we open source all of these. PCI compliance is one, a CIS baseline for those commercial guys. And as of about 2 weeks ago, we got our content validated by NIST. So it's that third-party auditing that says, like if we make a claim for 30-character passwords, it fails when they're set to 5, and it passes when they're set to 40. So that's super and sub-compliance testing. And then they also do a limited amount of false positives. So we did our release last week, and that's what I'm going to show for the demos.
Yeah, and so USGCB is a U.S. government configuration baseline, which is run by NIST. It's a program run by NIST that vendors can submit security guidance for, and then once it passes a series of validations by NIST, it can be considered the U.S. government security configuration baseline for that product, and Red Hat has submitted that to NIST.
And passed.
And passed. Okay, great. And so it should be available. If it's not up, it should be available on NIST's website shortly for federal agencies. And it's fully automated and everything. And of course, for national security systems, NSA is involved and in the security guidance business again. And we'll be working with our partners at DISA on automation and approval. And like Sean said, the two projects that you want to pay attention to are OpenSCAP and indeed everything under the OpenSCAP umbrella, which includes SCAP Security Guide for the individual security settings that you might be interested in. And so just one quick example back to what I said before with regard to the requirements for IT products that we're driving as part of common criteria evaluation. We've got the requirement here in the sort of excessively verbose text that says, as part of the formal evaluation that vendors do, we would like you to provide your operational user guidance in automated formats like XCCDF. So let's see.
So with that, we'll spend like the next 30 minutes. We'll show you the code. We'll do some scans, show the scanning, remediation, bare metal, Docker. So before that, there's a surprising amount of commercial people here. So Jeff has to be whisked away to some executive forum or something.
No, it's the government luncheon across the hall.
Yeah. So any other kind of questions for Jeff immediately relating to like the government roadmap, security automation standards from the government? Yeah.
Where do I go? I mean, I know the starting point. Where do we end? So how do I make sure that the code that I'm writing today is going to be functional or valid like an year down the road? If I'm setting up my servers and I'm buying real 7 and I'm spending all that money, are you going to be in sync with Red Hat, or is Red Hat going to be in sync with what we need as a bank so that the monies that I have spent are not going to go for a waste in 2017 or 2018?
So yeah, so great question, and there's several dimensions to it. So hopefully I'll be able to cover at least one before running off. One way in which you stay in sync is by using what's provided as part of the product. And the really nice thing in this case is that there's an SCAP software as part of the product itself. So indeed, you don't have to install a third-party product in order to have the ability to scan and assess the system. So that, because it's provided as part of the Red Hat product, that stays perfectly in sync, which is excellent. The other part that you may be thinking of is the actual security baselines themselves, which has been, I think, it's been disappointing with regard to the speed with which those have been delivered by a variety of government agencies or other organizations. And we're studying this closely and trying to speed it up.
So so let's say the government comes out with new DoD requirements for medical records or DoD STIG or something like that. What Red Hat ends up doing is we're actually involved in the communities that write the standards. Anybody can be. It's on GitHub, and Jeff put a link there. So we're actually one of the steering committee members, so we participate in the policy, if you will. From there, we take it and actually put it into, well, these two projects, the SCAP content to write automated remediations or automated pass or fail. And from there, we rebase with every Red Hat service pack. So with RHEL 7.3, you'll have the latest content. 7.4, the latest content. So that's kind of how we ensure customers continue to be in sync with baseline development, whether it's DoD STIG or PCI just came out with a new version plus or minus a month ago. We'll ship all of those baseline updates in service packs. So you can yum update. For customers who need out-of-band updates, like RHEL 7.3, we had a code freeze last week. It'll ship in a couple months. So what happens if you need the updated PCI profile this week? For that, we, as Red Hat, offer what we call hot fixes. So the idea is it's escalated delivery of a future expedited delivery of a future release. And that's kind of a one-off, like we'd give it just to you as a bank or just to somebody else, and not necessarily make it public, but people could request it. Does that help? Yes. Okay.
Cool. Thanks. All right, I got to run off.
Jeff has to run, so with that, thank you.
So, thanks.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Microphone problems. And then you're good to go? All right. So yeah, Jeff is a little bit modest. He says he's the tech director, which is true, but he's also the highest ranking civilian in that division, the equivalent of a 2-star general. So it's really great to come. So how many people would have known that about him? So with that, we have these two projects. So the grand story is about 3-4 years ago, we got together with a bunch of govies, a bunch of industry, meaning like Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Booz Allen, and some others. And we went ahead and created this catalog of nerd knobs. And we got together and said, what are every security relevant check that we can possibly think of? And we just documented them. So over the past couple of years, Jeff and I met because I got a phone call. And it was, hi, this is Mr. Blank from the NSA. We'd like to talk to you about security. And I thought he was, full of crap, and that's not his real name. And you fast forward, we have about 100 different community members contributing code, about 24 government agencies, and that's now spanned to banks and airlines. So it's a huge, vibrant community. So with that, RHEL 7 ships a couple profiles today that are noteworthy. One of them is PCI compliance, so that's shipping. The other is what's called the DoD vendor STIG, the military baseline. As we just had the code freeze for RHEL 7.3 roughly last week, comes out in a couple months, we're adding profiles. The first is for FBI criminal justice systems, so courts and law enforcement, things like that. There's other one, we worked with CIA to open source what they call the C2S baseline. So the CIA went to Amazon and said, hey, we want a region of EC2 just for the intelligence community. Here's like $800 million, build us one. And Amazon took the money and did. So we've worked with Amazon and CIA to open source their baseline. It is directly derived from CIS, or the Center for Internet Security. As Red Hat, we are not allowed to call the profile CIS baseline because that infringes on their trademark. So what we have to say is that is CIS inspired. So I have to make, since I'm being videotaped, I have to make sure I say that. The other thing is what's called certified cloud provider. So the idea here is, wouldn't it be wonderful if I could use the same baseline that Amazon and Rackspace and Terramark attest to, where I don't necessarily need like the full blown out military system, but I want to make sure direct root login isn't enabled. I want to make sure my passwords are like 8 or 10 characters. And why don't we call it like a common core set of plus or minus 30 or 40 things. And then the other thing that's in progress is we're making content slowly for OpenShift, OpenStack, and JBoss. So the idea is, while we have secure baselines for RHEL, what about the infrastructure that runs them? So we've been a little deficient in that regard. So we need to own up to it. To that point, we've started to write content for OpenStack. Right now, it's plus or minus 30 or 40. I'll actually show it since the OpenStack PM is sitting in the front row. It's plus or minus 30 or 40 controls that go through Horizon, Nova, Neutron, and I want to say Swift, but I'll double check that. I'll double check that in a live demo. How about that? So one of the things we're trying to figure out is extending these security baselines beyond RHEL. Is OpenStack more important than OpenShift? Is JBoss more important than everything else? So what would you guys like to see? Like, I don't know how do you pull an audience? OpenStack, raise of hands. Very few. OpenShift? JBoss? What about everybody else? Yeah, Trevor. The what? Satellite? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Cool. So enough slides. Demos. So what I ended up doing is I'm going to switch to the command line and actually run some scans and show everything I just talked about. With that said, in the slide deck, it'll be posted to redhat.com. I went through and documented all the commands I'm about to run. So you can get the deck, copy and paste, installing all the tools, where to find the content on the system, breaking down how to get the profiles, how to run a scan. So there's no necessary need to take crypt notes here. So let me go ahead and get out. And is that kind of thing interesting to you? So you want to see, what the heck do we ship? Let's actually see it, right? Does anybody use SCAP today? More than I thought. All right. So with that, the very first thing we end up shipping is, let me pull it up, is we ship what are called, where's the PCI profile? So here is the RHEL 7 PCI profile. So the idea is it's human-readable prose guide. It's a big HTML document. All of this ships under user-shared doc. I am just cheating and using my development environment, so you see a weird URL. But it's user-shared doc, SCAP security guide, and they're all there. So with that, I can go through, and it's pretty basic, right? So how do I check file permissions? Well, I need to check UMass. I need to check permissions on important files. So who owns the Etsy shadow? It's pretty basic stuff. But when we go through, for one, you get the check, right? Make sure this is Etsy shadow. Run this command, and it sets it. This is a little bit of a hammer, but it also tells some rationale. and it gets what's called a CCE number, or a common configuration enumerator. The idea is for every nerd knob, we want to create a unique, I keep saying nerd knobs, maybe I should stop. For every configuration check, we give it a unique identifier, and that's kind of like a pivot point to policy references. So in this case, Red Hat configuration 267 maps to PCI section 8.7.3. What we end up then doing is transforming that into an HTML table where the first column, did not mean to click on that. The first column is like PCI requirement 1, PCI requirement 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way to 8. And then we document how we met that requirement. And I'll show that table in a minute. So AC6 is a NIST 853 reference. So it should actually, I'll have to double check why it didn't, but it should say NIST 853 AC6, PCI version blah 8.7. And then with that, we also include remediation scripts. So let's say you actually run this check, and Etsy Shadow is owned by Bob. Well, I want to remediate, so here's a command to do that. So we have these guides. With that, I also mentioned these human-readable tables. So let me show you the one for PCI here. PCI. So here's kind of that table I mentioned. Let me make it a little bit more readable. So apparently there's some requirement 8.1.8 that says, do screensavers. So we have a description of what to do, a description of rationale, a description of how to manually check if you didn't want to use our automation content. And as we go through, 8.1, 8.7, so forth. So these policy tables are really just, for one, it makes sure that we documented all of the controls in PCI, or DoD STIG, or the government recs. So is that kind of useful for you guys? These policy tables are actually quite annoying because we have to have like one screen with the PCI document and one screen with the SCAP code and link all of these through metadata. So it sounds like it's good, very useful. Cool. So human readable prose guide. Go through, get your table of contents, very easy to read. We have these policy mappings, and that actually brings us to the command line. So I'm going to cheat and become root. So part of that is a lot of the scans will read your audit rules file or your syscontrol or other memory settings that require root just to even see what the configuration value is. So you can kick off scans with sudo, or you can just sudo and root directly. It's totally up to you. So with that, OpenSCAP on the command line is a tool called OSCAP. OpenSCAP, OSCAP, and it allows us to do things like I want to evaluate a system, SSG rel 7ds. So I apologize. So when we actually run on the content itself, we can run a command called info that lists out all the available profiles that are to be deployed or can be scanned on the box. So I think a lot of people were from commercial, so I'll just randomly pick the PCI profile. XCC df eval profile. I can give it the profile name. But I'm also going to do a couple things. var www.html summit PCI.html. I'm going to create an XML file of results. So the idea is I don't want to just have stuff fly by the screen and give me pass or fail. I want to generate like a human readable HTML report that has colors and pictures and red light, green light. So that's that -- report. Right now I'm showing command line. In a minute I'll show some GUIs. XML. And I want to give it my data stream. So what did I do? Oh. Plural. Results, plural. Why can't I command insert? So my bad. This is my personal development laptop. Clearly, I am up to spec on all of the security standards as all of my fails fly by. But ultimately, as it goes through here, it's really just doing this command line output because writing a percentage complete in Python is annoying. So we just outputted per rule where it is. So right now it's actually going through my entire box and verifying RPM permissions. Apparently I really need to secure my box a little bit. I did not imagine that would be in the live demo. You know what? I don't have a single pass. Oh, there we go. All right. Well, my audit logs are owned by root. I am ready to put my machine on the internet. And I have NTP servers turned on. So all this is good, and now I'm complete. I didn't get any errors, pass or fail. So how do I turn this into something more usable that I can like email my boss or whatever? So if you notice, I outputted it to like var dub HTML. It's because I'm running on a virtual machine here. So where is PCI? So if I go through, basically, hey, this is a PCI profile provided by Red Hat. I get some little statistics about my host name. I do not have FQDN set, but if I did, it would show it here. The timestamp, the profile. What's also nice is it will make sure it shows who the scan was performed by. So you notice I actually sudoed bash. It'll take the effective user ID of that shell session. So in my case, my username is Sean W. So even though I ran the scan as root, it knows it was me. Tells me it's on rel 7, gives me some IP address info, and let me. This is still pretty big. It gives me some results. So I passed a couple things more than apparently my 3 audit rules that I thought, and then I failed some things and severities. So we use, largely because a lot of the code contributors are from the government, we use government definitions of high, medium, low. So it's effectively like a high severity finding would be something that is remotely exploitable or would lead to elevated privileges in an arguably trivial way. So like direct root login over SSH, we'd consider that a high finding. Not having the right file permissions set on your ntp.conf might be like a moderate, maybe. So I can go through here, and I get now my results, my red light, green light Christmas tree. So I get some highs. It'll tell you the severity of the rule. It's not particularly ordered in any way. It just happens to be all highs and mediums here. Your pass or fail. But you'll also notice there's one called a result called not checked. And what that ultimately means is that there are some controls that we recognize as security relevant, like make sure you have all of your patches applied. But how do I automate the security check of that? Like, especially if you're disconnected from the internet. I can't do like a yum check update. So we recognize the validity of the rule, but we may not be able to automate it. Like, do you have badge readers on your data center? I can't. What file do I regex to let you know that? So not checked. So if I click on one like install aid, that's going to be a complicated one. So where is inactivity timeout? So I failed this rule. I get my identifier. I get my policy mappings. This is the DoD one. I get a description of what it actually checked, like a human readable, hey, we checked these files for this name pair value kind of thing. And then if I scroll down, you'll notice there's a bit of a remediation script. So all of these are written in bash. And it was really because if we had to pick a remediation language, like Chef, Puppet, and Ansible are the better choices, but we, in no particular order, but we cannot necessarily guarantee that Puppet is installed on every Red Hat endpoint. But we can guarantee that bash will be. So we chose bash first. And that was the extended logic of it. As we move on, I'll show you how we're starting to write extensions for Puppet and Ansible, but today it's all bash-based. As a result, though, there's no undo. So fair warning. So I go through, I can do my bash remediations. That was actually a little bit of a complicated one for some reason. Maximum age is, yeah, so that's probably an easier one, right? So it takes the variable. Apparently, this baseline was checking PCI compliance, means passwords have to be changed every 3 months. So it goes ahead and changes that in your files. So is that useful? Is this report useful? What do you guys use anything today for similar? Some people said they're not using SCAP, like Tripwire, QRadar. Some people. All right. The other thing that Jeff mentioned is we wanted to sever the tie between tools, security analysis tools or evaluations, and content. My personal frustration, I work in the DoD space, so we would go to the US Navy, who at their time was using called something SPAWAR SCAP Compliance Checker. It was like this command line utility wrote by some people in the Navy, and it was fine. But then I would go to the FBI, they would use a different tool. So even though they were checking the same rule, like password lengths equals 90 days, one would say true, one would say false. So they each had their own proprietary content. They'd argue over which one's better, and it was really frustrating. So what we've ended up doing is all of this SCAP code we wrote to a formal spec. So we can actually ingest it to Splunk or Tripwire or QRadar or the Red Hat satellite. So in that way, we can have consistent security scans regardless of what tool you use. So I forgot to mention that earlier. So where was I? I ran a scan of the PCI compliance profile. I have this really pretty HTML result. I can click, and great, I can see all this. So then, how do I get all this remediation out of an HTML report, and how do I run it? Is usually the next question. So in that case, if you notice, let me make this a little bit bigger. So if you notice, I started my command as OSCAP XCCDF eval. All I would end up needing to do, should I do this on my live demo machine? Is this like a double dog dare? So I'm actually a little bit nervous now. So let's take my own advice. So before you remediate, remember it's bash, and it's kind of scary. So it's important to actually take a look at what it changes. So passwords, well, I don't have any accounts with empty passwords. Maximum age, I know I haven't changed my password in 2 years on my development VM. I certainly don't, my password's password, so I don't have any of these set. Log files, audit events. I'm clearly up to date on my audit events. So, yeah, well, all right. God help me. So, what it's doing right now, that dash remediate will go ahead and it does 2 passes. The first pass is it will generate the pass-fail report that you just saw. With that, I noticed, I didn't necessarily go through it, but it has that XML file, that dash results that I mistyped. It generates an XML file that one of those tags actually has, it's called fix tag, and that's where we embed all of the bash scripts. So it does a first pass, it generates that XML file, and when it's done with that, it will take the XML and extract all of the bash and run it one by one, make sure it doesn't error on any particular one. So that's called the remediation phase. And then it will do a second pass where it goes through and will, oh, here we go. Oh, that's fine. It'll do a second pass and go through and make sure that it fixed everything that was broken originally. So, what this is. So this dash fetch remote sources. So if I added this remote sources, it would go ahead and download CVE data for me. So it would marry my configuration of PCI compliance to make sure I have all of the latest CVE vulnerabilities patched as well. So now it's doing remediation, and at least it installed aid. So you can go through, this is that remediation phase, and it says fix, so it'll take a second. Yeah.
A lot of machines I run use PTP for their time, which does not play nicely with NTP. So we feel that the spirit of the rule is complied with. We've
Yep.
got accurate time synced from an external source. But this would fail on
this would
our
break your
machines.
settings. Yeah.
And if we did the remediation, it would then break PTP. So this is, just one example. Could we turn that check off or even extend that check ourselves?
Yeah, so the question was how do I take the PCI baseline and tailor it? So check what I want, uncheck what I don't want, and I'll show you that next. So I still have a system. That's a good sign. So while it's running through, if you'll notice.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
One question, please. So what we are doing here is we are putting the fix on your laptop, right?
Yep.
Or any
That's a
VM,
VM,
or
but
any
yeah.
box, right?
Yeah.
So in a CI/CD world where I spawn, hundreds of VMs using my scripts, is there a way to go fix my baseline scripts for the failures that we have discovered, or maybe we would have already done that, during the testing of my VM scripts, check one and make one pass.
Yes.
And then use that to spawn your other REST 2.300, whatever.
Yeah, so I made a note, and I'll show that to you.
Okay, thank you.
So with that, I am dangerously at a 10-minute warning sign. So why don't we speed it up? These are remediations. It's going to fix stuff. Hopefully I don't crash my laptop. Showing a bunch of fixes on the screen is really boring. So to your question about tailoring the PCI profile, what we ended up doing was writing a tool called SCAP Workbench. It's available on Mac, Windows, and Linux. It's actually, I think, the only Red Hat tool that is. So the guy who wrote it's in the front row, so you can thank Martin. Yeah, seriously, he wrote it. And he caught a lot of crap from his manager. So this is a big validation of him compiling it and cross-compiling it. So it's really great. I'm sorry, I clicked too fast. So I load up SCAP Workbench. I close my chat that popped up. And I'm provided with a series here's all of the content that we ship. RHEL 5, RHEL 6, you'll notice some other things, CentOS, whatever, Chrome, Firefox. So let's just arbitrarily pick RHEL 6 and choose the C2S, which is that CIS benchmark, the CIS derived or whatever, CIS inspired is my on-video recorded thing. And, oh, sorry, I clicked. So again, this is a GUI tool. So I could actually scan my remote systems through this tool. You get the HTML report like you just saw. But for this conversation, I want to customize it. So I hit customize. I can give it a name, Summit Demo 2016. All this gobbledygook in front of it is part of the SCAP naming schemes. We generate it automatically for you. You don't necessarily have to keep it, but other tools like Tripwire and Splunk expect it to be named in this way. So I'm going to hit OK. And I'm brought to a screen with checkboxes. So let's say I'm running on EC2, and I don't have a VM with its own partition for temp and var log, and I want to stop failing those rules because that's really annoying. Well, I can uncheck that whole group. If I go through and where's a good one? My daemon UMasks. So by default, the CIS or C2S profile looks for UMask 022. I want to change that to 027. I want to, Dan Walsh is going to kill me. I want to disable SE Linux. So, with a check of a button, you can make Dan lose all of his hair. Or maybe instead of enforcing, I just want to put it into permissive, which maybe he won't kill some kittens. So I hit confirm change, and great. Now I have the C2S customized profile. Wonderful. I can go ahead and scan a box, but really I want to save this and ingest it into a CM tool. If you're running SCAP Workbench on on Linux, it will go ahead and generate an RPM for you that you can ingest into a Yum repo or satellite. If you're running it on anything else, it just generates what's called a customization file. It's like a XML spec. Why don't we call it a tailoring file or a drift file? And I'm going to save this as Summit tailoring. And it's saved. So, hey, look at that. My remediation didn't crash my box. It worked. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, so the question was, like, let's say I take a PCI profile and I uncheck a bunch of stuff. I don't want to have that be held against me in terms of like percent complete or percent compliant. So yes, the updated profile would not include those rules. So let me make this, or attempt to make this a little bit reasonable. So 5 minutes. In this profile ID, I basically say, hey, I created something called Summit Demo 2016 that extends the base CIS profile. So it's a way in code to basically say what I took and what I changed and codify that. A bunch of random SCAP things. But as I go through, you'll notice now there's rule selections like my entire group of disk partitioning is now false. My variable for SE Linux, I am enforcing SE Linux, but however, the state is now set to permissive. So it has like this variable refinement. What's nice is I'm showing the XML for one just to show you that it's codified, but behind the scenes, I showed you that policy mappings table, that HTML prose guide, like a privileged user guide. When I create this tailoring file, you can regenerate all of those HTML guides dynamically for you. Yeah.
The standards, sorry. If you had some local site requirements that weren't captured in one of the standards documents, some additional security controls, could you write those into a file either with the Workbench tool or some other way and then like merge it so you have like a comprehensive one based on like C2S plus some additional brand new rules or?
Sure.
Okay.
So the question is like if I have, I'm going to demo something and then I'm going to come back to that. Fair? Cool. So I got 3 minutes. I'm trying to be like super respectful of everybody's time. So while I do that, about 5 people before the session came up and said, like, Sean, that's great. You're scanning rel hosts, but what the heck do I do with OpenShift and Docker? What do I do? So the question was, how do I introspectively scan my Docker registry for like PCI compliant? So all of my Docker images, I want to know if they're PCI compliant. All of my OpenShift environment, I want to know if they're CVEs. So it's actually kind of intimidating to like demo the code of the guy who wrote it, which is Martin again. So he wrote a tool called OSCAP Docker that we now ship in Rel 7. So OSCAP Docker. It's the same command syntax. It's the same everything. And it will go ahead and Docker info. Ugh. Just making sure it's running. Docker images. So on my box, I just have a Docker image of Rel 7. Nothing super sexy. It's not running. So I can actually go in and introspectively scan a Docker image that is turned off for, in this case, I'm using what's called, I'm using the PCI report. So xccdf eval. So in case that happened, I went ahead and Help me out. See why it's intimidating to have him in the room? No, OSCAP Docker. Hey, thank you. So I tried to have it in my. That's what you get for live demos. But the idea is, as soon as I get my command syntax right, even though I'm copy and pasting, it'll go ahead and run a Docker scan. So with that, I am officially out of time, but I will be here. Any other kind of questions? Was this worth your while? Very good.
Yeah, we got 2 questions.
Yeah.
You showed us how to scan single OS instances and generate reports. My question is, what if I have 1,000 Linux hosts, mostly Rel 6, Rel 7? how do I get a report, an overall report over all of them?
Sure. So the question was, how do I scan multiple nodes? Group of systems, 1,000 systems. So for that, you'd use something like satellite. I did run out of time for the demo, but it is in satellite. We go through, you can choose your profile like PCI or US government, and it will go ahead and scan a group of systems, like a host group, like all of production, and you can get a per host report, pass, fail, so forth. And then you can also go in and view the HTML report as well. So you get a centralized roll-up of all of production, like 80% of my production systems pass. And then you can also go in on a per host basis and drill down for a report. 6. Satellite 6. Shipping today. And if you have more questions, come see me. I'll be hanging out here. And as a plug, it's great to have Jeff here, but the session reviews are incredibly important to allowing us to have having Jeff come back, having me come back. So please, we review every single report. So if you get a chance, give us a session review on the app, or I think there are floating papers around. And I'll be up here for questions.